The multiverse is a tapestry of infinite realities, each with its own immutable laws. But what happens when a thread from one universe tears through into another, bringing power that shouldn't exist? Somewhere between dimensions, reality screamed. The last thing the Doomslayer remembered was the roar of a Baron of Hell collapsing under chainsaw and fury, its death shriek dissolving into the sulfur-thick air of a rift he had cracked open himself. Argent energy had spiked wild, unstable, hungry, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the ground beneath him had simply ceased to exist. He fell through nothing, not the fire and bone ash of hell, not the void between Argent D'Nur and earth he had crossed 1,000 times before. This nothing had a different texture, cold, ancient, and threaded with something that made the hair on his neck rise beneath the praetor suit, a wrongness, old and patient, like rot beneath a mountain rather than fire beneath a battlefield. Then there was ground again. He hit stone hard enough to crater it, servos in his armor absorbing the impact with a hiss of released pressure. Dust rose around him in a slow, choking cloud, lit by unfamiliar light, not the hellish red of Argent D'Nur, not the fluorescent white of a UAC facility. This was harsh and blue-white, industrial, artificial, portable floodlights on tripods, the kind of light humans rigged when they were digging for something they didn't want anyone else to see. The Slayer rose to one knee, plasma rifle already in hand before his mind had finished processing the shift. Old instinct. Hell could be anywhere. Hell could look like anything. But this wasn't hell. The chamber around him was vast, cut from dark rock, ribbed with support struts of a make he didn't recognize. Dense alloy, riveted in patterns too clean, too deliberate for anything he'd seen on Earth, or in the depths of Argent D'Nur. Cables ran along the walls in thick black arteries, feeding banks of humming equipment clustered around a fissure in the chamber's center, a crack in the stone itself, pulsing faintly with a light that had no business existing. Not fire, not plasma, a deep, bruised purple-black, breathing like something alive. The Slayer's HUD flickered, confused, failing to classify the readings. Argent energy sensors spiked and stuttered. Whatever that fissure was radiating, it wasn't hellfire. But it wasn't clean either. It carried the same signature he'd hunted across 2 galaxies and 1 ruined heaven, the unmistakable stink of corruption. Old evil, wearing an unfamiliar face. Voices, human or human enough, clipped, disciplined, speaking a language his suit's translator matrix began parsing in fragmented bursts. Anomaly, unauthorized presence, secure the perimeter. Armored figures emerged from the dust and floodlight haze, rifles rising in practiced unison, white-plated soldiers in matte armor, faceless behind T-visored helmets, moving with the drilled precision of men who had never once questioned an order. Blaster rifles, not human ballistics. Energy weapons. He cataloged it in half a second, the same way he cataloged everything. Threat, capability, kill priority. They shouted something. A warning, maybe. A demand to stand down. He didn't understand the words. He didn't need to. What he understood was the fissure behind them, throbbing with a darkness that matched every enemy he had ever torn apart with his bare hands. What he understood was that these soldiers stood between him and the source of that wrongness, guarding it, protecting it, feeding it with their machines and their floodlights and their quiet, terrified reverence. That was enough. The first trooper never got the order out. The Slayer closed the distance in a blur of green and gray. The praetor suit's boosted stride eating 20 meters in under 2 seconds. His gauntleted fist met the trooper's chest plate with a crack of shattering polymer and bone, the body folding backward into 2 more soldiers before any of them managed to fire a shot. Blaster bolts began to sizzle through the dust a heartbeat later, wild, panicked, chasing a target that had already moved. He didn't run from the fire, he ran through it. The super shotgun came up in one fluid motion, and the chamber lit with muzzle flash and screaming. 2 more troopers went down in a spray of sparks and blood, their armor no match for a weapon forged to gut demons twice their mass. A third tried to fall back toward a comm unit bolted to the chamber wall, shouting into it with real fear in his voice now. Not discipline, not duty, just animal terror, finally breaking through the training. The Slayer put him down before the message finished transmitting. Silence returned to the chamber, broken only by the hum of failing equipment and the low, patient pulse of the fissure at its heart. 10 bodies, less than 90 seconds. He had barely registered them as a threat before they'd stopped being one. He turned toward the fissure itself, weapon still raised, HUD casting error after error as it tried and failed to categorize the energy bleeding from the crack in the stone. It wasn't hell. He was certain of that now. But it wanted to be something like it. Patient, hungry, old in a way that made even argent corruption feel young by comparison. Somewhere above him, alarms began to wail through the facility. Distant, echoing through corridors he hadn't yet seen, carried by soldiers who now knew, with absolute certainty, that something had come through their excavation that no briefing had prepared them for. The Doomslayer did not know what galaxy he had fallen into, or what these people called the darkness they were digging toward. He did not know their wars, their gods, their history stretching back further than he could guess. He knew only that where there was corruption, there was work to do. He reloaded the super shotgun with a practiced, mechanical motion, eyes fixed on the pulsing fissure, and began walking toward the sound of the alarms. If you want to see more crossover battles and unexpected universe collisions, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and universe you'd want to see in the comments below. Let's explore the infinite together. Somewhere in a command bunker miles above the excavation chamber, an Imperial officer stared at a security feed that made no sense. A lone figure in green armor, walking calmly out of a bloodbath, weapon raised, hunting something the Empire had spent a decade trying to keep secret. He picked up a comm line reserved for only the highest priority. This would need to reach Lord Vader immediately. The bunker officer's hands trembled as he keyed the priority channel, static crackling before the voice on the other end cut through. Flat, mechanical, edged with barely restrained menace. This had better warrant the interruption. "My lord, we have an unauthorized incursion at excavation site Ashvar 9. 10 troopers dead in under 2 minutes. The intruder is." The officer hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't sound insane. Not identifiable. No armor signature in our database. No affiliation markers. He walked into the primary chamber and eliminated the entire security detail with melee force and conventional weaponry. He's now moving through the lower levels toward the containment fissure. Silence stretched on the line, heavy enough that the officer began to sweat through his collar. "Send the recording," Vader said finally. The feed transmitted in a burst of compressed data, and somewhere in a Star Destroyer's meditation chamber orbiting the excavation world of Cathal Rift, Darth Vader watched a stranger in green-plated armor tear through a squad of his finest with the casual efficiency of a man swatting insects. No hesitation, no wasted movement. Every strike calculated to kill in the fewest possible actions. Vader had seen countless warriors in his long and violent life. Jedi masters, bounty hunters, the elite of the Emperor's royal guard. He recognized skill when he saw it. But this was something else. Something that moved like a weapon built for a single purpose. Stripped of every instinct except violence and forward momentum. More troubling was what he felt when he reached out through the Force toward the recording, searching for some trace of the intruder's presence in the currents of light and dark that wove through the galaxy. There was nothing. Not the absence of a force-blind civilian, which still carried a faint ripple, a shape in the water even if the swimmer couldn't feel it. This was different. A void. A shape, cut out of the Force entirely, as though the stranger existed in defiance of it rather than simply lacking sensitivity to it. Vader had felt something like this only once before, in a fragment of ancient Sith text, describing warriors from beyond the boundaries of known space. Beings the dark side itself seemed to recoil from, not because they were pure, but because they were other, alien to the very fabric the Force was woven from. "Increase security at Ashvar 9 to maximum," he said. "I am dispatching Inquisitor Vec Torvain. No one engages the intruder until she arrives. Am I understood?" "Yes, my lord." The channel closed. Vader remained in the dim red light of his chamber a moment longer, turning the recording over again in his mind. Ashvar 9 was no ordinary dig site. The fissure his engineers had spent 3 years excavating was a wound in the dark side itself, a nexus of ancient Sith corruption predating even the Old Republic, the kind of power the Emperor coveted above nearly anything else in the galaxy. If this stranger had come through that wound, rather than simply toward it, the implications were staggering. He reached for his comm again. The Emperor would need to know. 4 levels below the surface, the Doomslayer moved through Ashvar 9's excavation corridors, with the same relentless economy he brought to every hellhole he'd ever cleared. The facility was a maze of reinforced tunnels and half-finished chambers, clearly built in haste around whatever the Empire had found buried in this world's bedrock. Portable generators lined the walls, feeding power to drilling rigs and scanning arrays that had all gone dark the moment the alarms began wailing. He passed through checkpoint after checkpoint of abandoned equipment. The troopers who should have been manning them either fled or reassigned to a defensive perimeter he hadn't reached yet. Good. Fewer obstacles between him and the source of the wrongness he could feel pulsing through the rock like a second heartbeat. His HUD flickered again, throwing up fragments of translated text scraped from terminal screens he passed. Words like Sith, dark side, ancient nexus, containment failure risk. None of it meant anything to him yet, but patterns were forming. This wasn't a demonic incursion in the way he understood it. No hell-spawned horrors clawing through the walls, no argent corruption twisting flesh into weapon. This was quieter, more insidious. A darkness that worked through willing hands rather than monstrous ones. Soldiers, scientists, officers, all serving something they didn't fully understand. He'd fought that kind of evil before too. It never ended well for the ones who served it. A heavier resistance line met him at the entrance to the primary excavation shaft. A full platoon this time, backed by a walking assault turret bristling with heavier cannons than the standard trooper rifles. Someone up the chain had finally taken the threat seriously. The turret opened fire the instant he crossed its sensor threshold, heavy bolts chewing through the corridor wall where he'd stood half a second earlier. He was already moving, closing distance in short, controlled bursts, using support pillars for cover as the platoon added their own fire to the barrage. A grenade sailed from his hip in a smooth underhand throw, detonating beneath the turret's leg joints and sending it toppling sideways in a shower of sparks. The platoon broke formation, some falling back, others charging forward in a last desperate push. He met the charge with the chainsaw, its engines screaming to life in a language every living thing on every world seemed to understand instinctively. The sound of something that ate resistance for breakfast. 90 seconds later, the corridor was his. He reloaded in the sudden quiet, boots crunching over spent casings, and continued toward the pulsing dark at the heart of the facility, utterly unaware that above him, in orbit, a Sith Lord was already moving to intercept, and further still, on a throne shrouded in shadow, an ancient and patient evil had just felt something ripple through the dark side that intrigued him more than anything had in decades. The Emperor of the Galaxy sat alone in his private chamber aboard the Death Star's command superstructure, hooded and still, his attention turned inward toward currents only he could perceive. For most beings, the dark side was a tool, a weapon, a source of raw and terrible power to be bent toward ambition. For Sheev Palpatine, it was something closer to a second set of senses, a vast ocean he had spent 60 years learning to read like a sailor reads the wind. And something had just disturbed the water at Ashvar 9. He had felt the fissure's power for years now, a slow and steady pulse radiating from beneath that world's crust. Ancient, patient, the residue of a Sith ritual older than the Republic itself, one that promised secrets he had been carefully, methodically extracting for over a decade. But this was different. A sudden violent disruption, a tear in the pattern, as though something had reached through from the other side of that ancient wound and dragged a piece of itself into his galaxy. He reached out further, probing gently, the way a physician might press against a wound to gauge its depth. What he found unsettled even him. A presence utterly without force sensitivity, and yet not absent the way an ordinary being was absent, carved out, deliberate, as though something in the intruder's very nature refused the force's touch, the way flesh refuses fire. And beneath that void, layered thick as ancient stone, an emotion so pure and so old it took Palpatine a long moment to name it. Hatred. Not the petty, reactive hatred of a soldier in battle, or the simmering resentment of the ambitious. This was hatred distilled to its purest possible form. Focused, eternal, aimed like a blade at a single category of existence. Palpatine had spent his life cultivating hatred in others, shaping it, feeding it, bending it to his will. He recognized craftsmanship when he felt it, even from a source he couldn't identify. Whatever this being was, it had not simply arrived at Ashvar 9 by accident. It had been drawn there, called by something in its nature that recognized the fisher's corruption for what it was. The Emperor allowed himself something close to a smile. Fascinating. He opened his eyes and reached for the comm panel embedded in his throne's armrest. Lord Vader. My Emperor. Vader's voice, still edged with the tension of the unfolding crisis at Ashvar 9. I am aware of the situation at the excavation site. You will proceed to intercept the intruder personally, as planned. But I want him alive, Lord Vader. Whatever this creature is, its capture would prove invaluable. And if it cannot be taken alive, a pause, brief and considering. Then we will learn what we can from the wreckage it leaves behind. But I suspect, Lord Vader, that this will not be so simple a matter. 300 kilometers below the Emperor's throne room, in a starship hangar on the far side of the galaxy from Ashvar 9, a very different conversation was taking place in hushed, urgent tones. You're telling me a single intruder wiped out 2 platoons and an assault turret at an Imperial black site, and Command is treating it like a containment breach instead of an opportunity? The speaker was a woman in patched flight leathers, arms crossed, dark eyes narrowed with the particular skepticism of someone who had survived the Empire's underestimation more than once. That's what the intercepted chatter says, Reyes. The man beside her, a rebel intelligence analyst named Tobin Ari, tapped through a data slate covered in fragments of stolen Imperial comm traffic. Ashvar 9's been a black hole on our scans for 3 years. Whatever they're digging up down there, it's important enough that Vader himself is flying out personally. And now there's a lone operative tearing through their defenses like wet paper. According to this, he's not identified as any known faction. No armor matches. No weapon signatures on file. Command thinks he might be some kind of experimental asset. Maybe even one of theirs that's gone rogue. Reyes studied the grainy security footage looping on the slate's display. A hulking figure in green armor, moving through Imperial corridors with brutal, mechanical efficiency, cutting down trained soldiers like they were nothing. There was something almost hypnotic about the economy of it. No wasted motion, no hesitation, just relentless, forward momentum. Or, she said slowly, he's exactly what he looks like. Someone who hates the Empire enough to walk into one of their most secure facilities alone and start killing everyone in his way. That's a hell of an assumption. It's a hell of an opportunity, Ari. If Vader's flying out personally, that means whatever's down there matters. And if this intruder is causing them this much trouble, maybe he's exactly the kind of chaos we need on our side. Or at least, not against us. She straightened, decision settling into her shoulders the way it always did, once she'd made up her mind. I'm taking a team to Ashvar 9. If there's a chance to make contact with whatever this thing is, before the Empire boxes it in, I want to take it. And if it's hostile to us too. Reyes was already moving toward the hangar's ready room, pulling flight gear from a locker as she spoke. Then we'll find that out the hard way, same as everyone else has today. Behind her, the security footage looped again. The intruder reloading a brutal, oversized shotgun in the sudden quiet of a corridor littered with bodies. His posture radiating a patience that felt more dangerous than the violence that had preceded it. Whatever he was searching for in that facility, he was not going to stop until he found it. Ari watched the footage a moment longer, then reached for his own gear. Guess we're finding out the hard way too. The Rebel shuttle Wandering Star dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Ashvar 9's system, its hull dulled with a matte gray finish, designed to slip past casual scans. Reyes sat in the cockpit beside her pilot, watching the excavation world grow from a pinprick to a rust-colored sphere, wreathed in thin, hazy atmosphere. "Imperial presence?" she asked. "Heavy," the pilot confirmed, eyes flicking across the sensor board. "2 Star Destroyers in high orbit, and that's just what we can see. Whatever's happening down there, they're not taking chances." Reyes leaned back, jaw tight. A 5-person infiltration team against 2 Star Destroyers worth of firepower was not a fight they could win in any conventional sense. But conventional wasn't the plan. The plan was to reach the surface, locate the intruder before Imperial forces boxed him in, and find out, carefully, cautiously, whether he represented an opportunity or a threat. "Take us in low," she said. "Follow the same debris field the last supply convoy used. If their sensor gaps are still there, we can slip through underneath the patrol nets." The shuttle dove. Far below, in the lower excavation levels of Ashvar 9, the Doomslayer had reached the outer perimeter of the primary containment chamber, the true heart of the facility, where the ancient fissure pulsed behind 3 layers of blast doors and a small army's worth of remaining defenders. His HUD registered the energy readings spiking the closer he drew, the wrongness growing sharper, more insistent, like a wound crying out to be lanced. He had left a trail behind him that Imperial Command would spend weeks cataloging. Checkpoints stripped of personnel, drilling equipment reduced to slag, an entire research wing reduced to scorched silence. None of it slowed him. None of it was meant to. The final blast door loomed ahead, reinforced durasteel 3 meters thick, flanked by heavy weapon emplacements bolted into the rock itself. A voice crackled over an external speaker system, basic this time, translated cleanly by his HUD. "Unidentified hostile. You are ordered to stand down and surrender your weapons. Failure to comply will result in lethal force." He didn't slow his approach. The emplacements opened fire in a coordinated barrage, heavy bolts chewing craters into the corridor floor as he moved through the storm with the same fluid, economical precision he'd shown since the moment he arrived. The BFG came up in both hands, its charge whine building to a scream, and when he fired, the green energy blast tore through both emplacements and half the blast door in a single detonation that rocked the mountain itself. Alarms screamed. Emergency lighting bathed the corridor in flickering red as the ruined blast door groaned and finally collapsed inward, revealing the containment chamber beyond. Vast, cathedral-like, its walls lined with scaffolding and scanning arrays all oriented toward the fissure at its center. The dark crack in reality pulsed larger here, wider, its purple-black light casting long shadows across dozens of remaining Imperial personnel who froze mid-motion at the sight of him standing in the ruined doorway. For a moment, nobody moved. Then a figure stepped forward from among the scientists and officers. Not Imperial armor, not a trooper's helmet, but a tall, dark-robed silhouette, radiating the same wrongness the Slayer had been hunting since he arrived. Concentrated and amplified 100-fold. Twin lightsabers ignited at the figure's sides, crimson blades hissing to life with a sound like tearing fabric. Inquisitor Vec Torvain had arrived ahead of schedule, and she was not interested in capture protocols. "Whatever you are," she said, voice carrying easily across the chamber, "you do not belong in this galaxy, and you have made a grave error coming here." The Slayer's HUD flagged her immediately as priority target. The density of dark corruption radiating from her body dwarfed everything else in the room, a beacon of exactly the kind of evil he had crossed dimensions to end. He didn't answer her. He never answered anyone. He simply reloaded the super shotgun and began walking forward. Torvain moved first, covering the distance between them in a blur of force-augmented speed, twin blades arcing toward his exposed throat with lethal precision. He caught the first blade on his forearm gauntlet, sparks screaming where energy met argent-forged alloy, and drove his other fist into her ribs hard enough to send her skidding backward across the chamber floor, boots carving furrows into the stone. She recovered mid-slide, flipping upright with impossible grace, genuine surprise flickering across her expression for the first time. No ordinary being simply blocked a lightsaber strike with bare armor and lived to throw a counterpunch. "Interesting," she murmured, resetting into a defensive stance. "Let's see how interesting you remain." She came at him again, faster this time, blades weaving intricate patterns designed to overwhelm and confuse. Each strike augmented by a force-fueled speed that should have been impossible to track. The Slayer met her anyway, blocking, dodging, countering with the brutal economy of a warrior who had faced far worse than a single angry swordswoman. Every clash rang through the chamber like a bell, sparks and ozone filling the air, as combatants who should not have existed in the same universe tested each other's limits. Behind them, the remaining Imperial personnel scrambled for cover, torn between the duty to observe and the animal instinct to flee. Above the chamber, unnoticed by either combatant, the fisher's pulse had begun to quicken, as though the ancient darkness sealed within was responding, hungrily, to the violence unfolding in its presence. Torvain drove a force push toward the Slayer's chest, invisible pressure slamming into him hard enough to crack stone beneath his boots. He staggered, but did not fall, and when he looked up, his HUD flooding with damage warnings and tactical recalculations, something in his posture shifted. Not fear, something closer to recognition. Whatever these Sith called their power, it was real. It was dangerous. And it was, without question, the same shape of evil he had spent his entire existence hunting. The chainsaw roared to life in his hands, and Inquisitor Vec Torvain's grim satisfaction curdled, for just a moment, into something closer to doubt. The chainsaw's roar filled the chamber like a living thing, and Vec Torvain found herself, for the first time in years, genuinely uncertain how a fight would end. She had trained under the Emperor's own Inquisitorius program, had hunted the last scattered remnants of the Jedi Order across a dozen worlds, had faced down force-sensitive fugitives desperate enough to fight with everything they had. She knew what fear looked like in an opponent's stance, knew how to read the flicker of doubt that preceded a killing blow, but this creature offered her nothing to read. No fear, no hesitation, no emotional tell of any kind that her training had prepared her to exploit. She reached out through the Force again, mid-combat, searching for the thread of intention that always preceded a strike, the flicker of decision that let a trained Force user anticipate an opponent's next move half a second before it happened. She found nothing, not the void of a Force-blind civilian, which still carried faint eddies of instinct and emotion she could read. This was a true absence, a hole cut clean through the fabric she had spent her life learning to navigate. It was like fighting blind. The chainsaw came down in a diagonal arc, and she barely brought both blades up in time to intercept it, the shriek of grinding metal deafening even over the chaos of the chamber. The impact drove her back a full meter, despite her braced stance, her boots scraping furrows into ancient stone. She had faced Wookiees with less raw physical force behind their attacks. "What are you?" She didn't ask it aloud. There was no point. Whatever stood before her clearly had no interest in conversation, negotiation, or explanation, only in closing the distance and ending the fight as efficiently as possible, the same brutal calculus he had applied to every trooper and turret between the surface and this chamber. She shifted tactics, drawing on force speed to circle him, rather than meet him head-on, twin blades flashing in probing strikes, meant to find a gap in his guard, rather than overwhelm him directly. He turned to track her with unnerving precision, the chainsaw arcing to intercept each strike before it landed, his movements economical in a way that spoke of centuries of combat experience, rather than mere reflexes. Centuries. The thought arrived unbidden, and with it, a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's recycled air. She had felt ancient things before, Sith holocrons whispering secrets older than the Republic, artifacts steeped in millennia of dark-side corruption. But those things had a texture to their age, a weight she could feel pressing against her senses. This creature's age felt different, not accumulated like sediment, but renewed, as though something had died and returned, and died again more times than could be counted, each cycle sharpening rather than dulling the violence at its core. She broke off the exchange, retreating 3 steps and raising a hand, not in surrender, but to buy herself a moment to think, to reassess. The Slayer did not press the advantage immediately. He simply stood, chainsaw idling, watching her with an unreadable visor, patient in a way that felt more dangerous than any aggression could have been. "You're not force sensitive," she said aloud, testing the words. watching for any reaction. There was none. But you're not blind to this either, are you? You can feel it. The corruption in this place. Still no response. But something in the set of his shoulders shifted, and for the first time since the fight began, Torvain felt something close to certainty settle over her instincts. He wasn't here for her, specifically. He wasn't here for the Empire, or the Fisher's secrets, or any of the political calculus that had brought Vader's fleet to this system. He was here because whatever ancient thing was sealed in that fissure represented exactly the kind of enemy he had spent his entire existence hunting, and she was simply standing in his way. That realization should have offered her some strategic advantage. Instead, it left her colder than before. Because if that was true, then nothing short of total victory would make him stop. There would be no negotiation, no surrender terms, no diplomatic off-ramp, only the fight. Continuing until one of them could no longer continue it. A comm unit crackled at her belt, Vader's voice cutting through the tension with characteristic bluntness. "Inquisitor. Status. Engaged with the intruder, my lord," she said, not taking her eyes off the Slayer. "He is unlike anything in our files. I recommend immediate reinforcement. I am 3 minutes out. Do not allow him to reach the Fisher's core containment array. Whatever he intends for it, we cannot risk instability." "Understood." She closed the channel and reset her stance, twin blades humming with barely restrained energy. The Slayer's HUD, meanwhile, registered the pause in hostilities with clinical indifference, cataloging her retreat, her hesitation, the subtle shift in her readiness. He had fought countless enemies who paused before the end. Hell Knights recalculating, Barons reassessing, cultists realizing too late what they had summoned. The pause never changed the outcome. It only delayed it. He raised the chainsaw, revved it once, and resumed his advance. Behind them, deep within the Fisher's pulsing dark, something ancient and patient felt the violence unfolding above it and, for the first time in 3 years of careful, methodical excavation, began, almost imperceptibly, to stir. Darth Vader's shuttle touched down in the excavation site's primary landing bay with a hiss of stabilizing thrusters, and he was moving before the ramp had fully lowered, cape billowing behind him as he strode into corridors already scarred by the intruder's passage. He did not need reports to understand the scale of what had happened here. The evidence was written across every ruined checkpoint, every scorched wall, every body he stepped over, on his way toward the containment chamber's lower levels. Through the Force, he could feel Torvain's presence flickering with strain, her usual cold confidence fraying at the edges. That, more than any report, told him everything he needed to know about the severity of the threat waiting below. He reached the ruined blast door in under 90 seconds, boots crunching over slag durasteel as he stepped into the containment chamber itself, and stopped, for just a moment, taking in the scene before him. Torvain circled the intruder at the chamber's center, twin blades weaving defensive patterns, her movements sharper and more desperate than Vader had ever witnessed from her. The creature she fought moved with a brutal, unhurried economy that reminded him, uncomfortably, of his own early years. A warrior who had long since stopped fearing death, because death had stopped meaning anything to him. Vader ignited his lightsaber, the crimson blade casting fresh shadows across the chamber's scaffolding, and stepped forward. "Inquisitor, withdraw." Torvain didn't argue. She disengaged with a burst of Force-assisted speed, putting distance between herself and the intruder without a trace of the pride that might have compelled a lesser warrior to protest. Whatever she had learned in that exchange, it had clearly convinced her that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford here. The Doomslayer turned to face the new arrival, and his HUD flagged the reading instantly, a density of dark side corruption even greater than the Inquisitor's, wrapped around a presence that felt, disturbingly, almost mechanical. Not the corrupted flesh he'd cataloged in Hell's demons, nor the willing servitude he'd seen in the Empire's soldiers. Something else, a being who had been broken and rebuilt into a weapon, not unlike himself, except aimed in service of the darkness rather than against it. For the first time since his arrival in this galaxy, the Slayer felt something that might have been recognition. Vader raised his blade in a two-handed grip, and closed the distance in a single powerful stride. The strike aimed to bisect the intruder from shoulder to hip. The Slayer caught it on his forearm gauntlet exactly as he had with Torvain's blades. Sparks screaming, servos straining. But this time the impact drove him backward across the chamber floor, boots carving deep furrows through solid stone. Vader's strength, augmented by decades of force-honed power and mechanical enhancement, dwarfed anything the Inquisitor had brought to bear. The Slayer recovered his footing and answered with the BFG. The blast tore through the space Vader had occupied a half-second earlier, the Sith Lord vanishing in a force-augmented leap that carried him 30 feet upward into the chamber's scaffolding, momentum barely interrupted. He descended in a diving strike that the Slayer met with the Crucible Blade, the ancient energy weapon meeting Vader's lightsaber in a collision that sent a shockwave rippling through the chamber's supporting structure, dust and debris raining from the ceiling. The two warriors traded blows in a rhythm that neither Torvain nor the watching Imperial personnel could fully follow. Strikes fast enough to blur, each one carrying enough force to level a building, the chamber itself groaning under the strain of violence it was never built to contain. Vader's mastery of the Force let him anticipate and redirect, using telekinetic bursts to unbalance his opponent mid-strike, hurling debris and equipment into the Slayer's path with contemptuous efficiency. The Slayer adapted with the same brutal pragmatism he brought to every fight, using cover, using his weapon's full arsenal in rapid rotation, refusing to settle into any predictable pattern Vader could exploit. A grenade detonated at Vader's feet, forcing a force-shielded retreat. The chain gun opened up in a sustained burst that chewed through scaffolding and forced the Sith Lord into evasive maneuvers rather than offense. Neither combatant gained clear advantage, each testing the limits of an opponent unlike anything they had faced before. It was Vader who broke the stalemate, reaching through the Force not toward the Slayer directly, but toward the chamber itself, toward the scaffolding, the equipment, the very architecture surrounding them, wrenching it all inward in a crushing telekinetic vice. The Slayer found himself suddenly pinned between collapsing structure and immovable stone, servos screaming under pressure that would have crushed lesser armor instantly. Vader advanced through the dust and wreckage, blade raised for a finishing strike. "You have fought well," he said, voice carrying the particular flatness of a being who rarely bothered with commentary during combat. "But you are alone, in a galaxy that is not your own, facing power you cannot comprehend. This ends now." The Slayer's response came not in words, but in the sudden, violent activation of the Praetor suit's emergency systems. A concentrated burst of Argent energy that shattered the telekinetic grip with an explosive release, sending Vader staggering backward and scattering debris across the chamber like shrapnel. The Slayer rose from the wreckage, weapons already cycling toward readiness. HUD flooding with warnings about depleted power reserves he had no way to replenish in this galaxy. Somewhere above him, the ancient fissure pulsed brighter still, and both warriors, Sith Lord and interdimensional hunter alike, felt the ground beneath them tremble with something stirring far below. Vader lowered his blade fractionally, calculating. "Interesting," he said, echoing Torvain's earlier assessment without irony. "The Emperor will want to see this personally." The Slayer's arsenal was down to a fraction of its charge, HUD readouts flashing amber warnings across systems that had no way to replenish themselves in this galaxy. He had faced worse odds, entire legions of Hell's forces, gods who thought themselves untouchable, betrayals that had cost him everything he loved. But those fights had always ended the same way, with him standing, and everything else reduced to ruin. This time, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the mathematics felt different. Vader did not press the advantage immediately. Instead, he raised a gloved hand, and his voice, when it came, carried a note of genuine curiosity beneath its mechanical rasp. "You could have died a dozen times over in the last hour, and yet here you stand. The Emperor does not offer his attention lightly. He extends it to you now." A hollow projector embedded in Vader's gauntlet flickered to life, casting a small blue-tinted image into the chamber's dust-hazed air. A hooded figure, features obscured in shadow, voice arriving distorted and thin through the low-fidelity transmission. "Fascinating," the figure said, and even filtered through poor signal quality. Something in the tone made the hair on Torvain's neck rise where she stood watching from the chamber's edge. A being untouched by the Force, and yet drawn like iron to a lodestone toward the darkest well of power in this galaxy. Tell me, stranger, do you know what waits beneath this facility? The Slayer said nothing. He never did. But his HUD remained locked on the fissure at the chamber's heart, weapons still raised, refusing to lower his guard despite the transmission's interruption. I thought not, the Emperor continued, something like amusement threading through the words. Allow me to offer clarity then, in exchange for a moment of your patience. That fissure is a wound torn into the fabric of the dark side itself, the last remnant of a ritual performed 10,000 years ago by Sith lords who sought to bind an ancient and terrible power beneath this world's crust, rather than face its wrath directly. For 3 years, my scientists have labored to understand it, to harness what fraction of its power we safely could. The projection shifted, casting shadow across the fissure's pulsing light. You arrived through that wound, did you not? Which means you carry within you some understanding, however instinctive, of what waits on the other side. I propose an arrangement. Cooperate with my inquisitors. Help us complete the excavation, stabilize the breach, and I give you my word. The power contained within may offer precisely the pathway home you require. For the first time since his arrival, something in the Slayer's posture shifted, not toward acceptance, but toward a stillness that felt, to those watching, almost like consideration. He understood offers like this. He had heard them before, in different voices, from different mouths, always promising the same thing: cooperation in exchange for power, restraint in exchange for advantage, patience in exchange for a future that never quite arrived as promised. He had refused every one of them, because the pattern was always the same underneath the words. Corruption did not bargain in good faith. It simply waited for weakness to exploit. And yet the fissure's pull remained, a wrongness he could feel radiating through solid stone, patient and hungry, and growing stronger with every passing minute. If there was truth in what this shadowed figure claimed, if that wound truly represented a path back to his own galaxy, in the fight he had left unfinished against Hell's endless legions, then walking away without at least understanding it would be its own kind of failure. The Emperor seemed to sense the hesitation, however brief, and pressed his advantage with the practiced patience of a predator who had spent decades learning exactly how long to let silence stretch before filling it. Consider it, stranger. You have already proven yourself capable of surviving what my finest warriors could not withstand. Imagine what you might accomplish with the full weight of the Empire's resources behind you, rather than arrayed against you. Torvain's hand drifted, almost imperceptibly, toward her blade's activation switch, watching the exchange with an expression caught between professional wariness and something closer to genuine unease. She had served the Emperor long enough to recognize the particular cadence of his voice when he sensed an opportunity too valuable to lose, and long enough to recognize, too, the danger of whatever might happen if that opportunity refused him. The Slayer's HUD flickered through a final diagnostic sweep, cataloging depleted power reserves, damaged systems, the mounting cost of a fight against enemies who understood this galaxy's rules in ways he never could. Every tactical calculation argued for accepting the offer, at least provisionally, buying time, gathering information, finding the path of least resistance toward whatever answers waited in that ancient fissure. But tactics had never been the whole of what drove him. He had spent his entire existence, through death and resurrection, through the fall of Argent Denur and the endless corridors of Hell itself, refusing exactly this kind of bargain. Cooperation with corruption was corruption's oldest, most effective weapon. He had watched it hollow out entire civilizations, had cut down countless souls who told themselves the arrangement was temporary, that the compromise was strategic, that the darkness could be used rather than served. He raised the super shotgun, its charge indicator flickering but still functional, and leveled it directly at the hollow projection's flickering image. The Emperor's thin, distorted laughter crackled through the transmission a moment before Vader's gauntlet cut the signal. "I did not expect otherwise," Vader said quietly, reigniting his blade. The Emperor rarely does, when it comes to beings who understand exactly what they are looking at. The chamber fell into tense silence, broken only by the low, hungry pulse of the fissure and the mechanical hiss of two warriors resetting their stances for a fight that both now understood would not end in negotiation. The second clash began before either warrior had fully settled into position, Vader closing the distance with a force-augmented burst of speed that would have caught a lesser opponent flat-footed. The Slayer met him anyway, weapons cycling through what remained of his depleted arsenal, with the same brutal precision that had carried him through every corridor of Ashvar 9. But the strain was beginning to show, servos running hotter, movements fractionally slower than they had been an hour before. Torvain rejoined the fight from the chamber's flank, twin blades weaving a second front. The Slayer now had to track alongside Vader's relentless offense. Between them, the two Sith warriors began to press their advantage in earnest, coordinating strikes with the practiced synchronicity of hunters who had trained together for exactly this kind of engagement, overwhelming a single target through sheer weight of combined pressure. It was in the middle of this brutal exchange that the chamber's far wall exploded inward. The blast came without warning, concussive force scattering Imperial personnel and sending a wash of smoke and debris rolling across the chamber floor. Through the haze, 5 figures moved with the disciplined urgency of a strike team that had trained for exactly this kind of chaos. Reyes at point, blaster rifle raised, her small rebel squad fanning out behind her toward whatever cover the ruined chamber still offered. "We are not," Reyes shouted over the din, ducking behind a scorched support pillar as blaster fire and lightsaber sparks filled the air around her, getting paid enough for this. Her intelligence analyst, Ari, slid into cover beside her, eyes wide as he took in the full scope of the battle raging at the chamber's center. A Sith Lord, an Inquisitor, and something in green armor that was somehow holding its own against both simultaneously. "Reyes, that's Vader. That is actually Darth Vader." "I can see that, Ari. This was supposed to be a reconnaissance mission. Plans change." She raised her rifle and opened fire on the nearest cluster of Imperial personnel, scrambling to reform a defensive line, buying whatever chaos she could to tip the engagement in an unclear direction. Whether that direction favored the rebellion, the mysterious intruder, or neither, she genuinely didn't know yet. But two Sith Lords consolidating power over an ancient dark side artifact was, by any measure, worse than the alternative. The Slayer's HUD registered the new arrivals with clinical detachment, recalculating threat priorities on the fly. Reyes's team wasn't attacking him. Their fire was directed at Imperial personnel and, increasingly, at Torvain's flank, inadvertent allies in a fight they barely understood, buying him precious seconds of reprieve from the coordinated Sith assault. He used them. A grenade sailed toward Torvain's position, the explosion forcing her back and breaking the pincer formation she and Vader had built. The Slayer pivoted the moment the opening appeared, closing distance on Vader alone, chainsaw roaring as he pressed an advantage that would not last long against a warrior of the Sith Lord's caliber. Vader met the assault with contemptuous ease, catching the chainsaw's blade against his lightsaber and using the force to hurl the Slayer bodily across the chamber, crashing through a support strut that groaned ominously under the impact. Dust rained from the ceiling as the ancient architecture, already strained by the earlier battle, began showing genuine signs of structural failure. "Your allies," Vader said, turning toward Reyes's position with cold deliberation, "have made a grave miscalculation." He raised a hand, and 3 of Reyes's squad members found themselves lifted bodily off the ground, invisible fingers closing around their throats with mechanical precision. Reyes opened fire desperately, blaster bolts deflecting harmlessly off a force barrier that seemed to require no visible effort to maintain. The Slayer's HUD flagged the scene instantly, innocents in mortal danger, an enemy exploiting a defenseless position with casual cruelty. It was a pattern he recognized from 1,000 different battlefields across 2 galaxies now, the particular signature of evil that preyed on the vulnerable simply because it could. He didn't calculate odds. He didn't weigh his depleted reserves against the risk. He simply moved. The BFG's last charge tore across the chamber and struck Vader's shoulder at an oblique angle. The impact enough to shatter his concentration and send the three suspended rebels crashing back to the ground, gasping and clutching bruised throats but alive. Vader staggered, armor scorched and smoking, and turned back toward the Slayer with something in his stance that had shifted from cold calculation toward genuine anger. "You would spend your strength on strangers who mean nothing to you," Vader said, voice tight with barely restrained fury, "in a galaxy that is not your own." The Slayer reloaded in the sudden pause, Chainsaw's engine idling low, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing to say that this Sith Lord, wrapped so completely in the logic of power and dominance, would ever understand. Some things did not require justification. Protecting the defenseless from those who would exploit them was not a calculation. It was simply what needed to be done, the same instinct that had driven him through hell's endless corridors and would drive him through this galaxy's darkness with equal, uncompromising resolve. Reyes staggered upright, pulling her gasping squadmates back toward cover, staring across the wreckage-strewn chamber at the armored stranger who had just, inexplicably, spent his own advantage to save people he owed nothing. "Okay," she muttered, reloading her rifle with hands that hadn't quite stopped shaking. "Maybe he is one of the good ones." Above them all, deep within the fisher's pulsing heart, the ancient darkness continued its slow, patient awakening, drawn inexorably toward the violence, the desperation, and the raw, uncontained power, now converging at the threshold of its long imprisonment. The chamber trembled as the fisher's pulse quickened into something closer to a heartbeat, purple-black light bleeding outward in widening pulses that cast every combatant's shadow long and distorted across the ruined stone. Cracks spread from the fisher's edges, spidering through the ancient rock like veins, and a low, resonant hum began building beneath the sounds of battle, the unmistakable signature of a seal, 10,000 years old, beginning to fail. Vader felt it first, through the Force, a wrongness so profound it momentarily overrode even his fury toward the intruder standing across the chamber from him. He had studied the Ashvar excavation reports extensively. Whatever the ancient Sith had bound beneath this world, they had done so out of desperation, not ambition, a power even they had judged too dangerous to wield. "The containment is failing," Torvain called out, retreating from the widening fissure as tendrils of dark energy began licking across the chamber floor like living smoke. "My lord, the combat is destabilizing the seal." Vader's calculations shifted in an instant, priorities realigning with the ruthless efficiency that had kept him alive through decades of galactic war. Whatever satisfaction capturing the intruder might have offered the Emperor, it meant nothing set against the prospect of an ancient horror breaking free beneath an Imperial facility, in a system with no adequate defense against it. The Slayer felt it too, not through any mystical sense, but through the same instinct that had guided him through every hellhole he had ever cleared. The wrongness he'd been chasing since his arrival was no longer contained behind stone and machinery. It was here, gathering itself, and his HUD's threat assessment spiked into territory he hadn't seen since the deepest reaches of hell itself. The fissure tore open fully, with a sound like the galaxy itself screaming, and something vast and ancient began pulling itself through the breach. Not flesh, not quite shadow, but a writhing mass of dark-side corruption, given terrible, coalescing form. Ancient Sith texts had called it many names across 10,000 years of careful, fearful silence. What emerged in the ruined containment chamber cared nothing for names. It cared only for the millennia of hunger it had accumulated in its long imprisonment. Torvain's blades trembled in her grip, her carefully cultivated composure cracking for the first time since the Slayer's arrival. "That's not possible. The binding rituals were absolute." "Apparently not absolute enough," Vader said grimly, igniting his blade and turning to face the emerging horror alongside. For the first time, the intruder he had spent the last hour trying to kill. The Slayer didn't hesitate. Whatever alliance this represented, however temporary, the threat before them now was unmistakably, viscerally familiar. The same shape of evil he had spent his entire existence hunting, merely wearing an unfamiliar face. He raised his remaining weapons and advanced without a word, the chainsaw's roar joining the crackling hum of two lightsabers, as three warriors who had been trying to kill each other moments before turned as one toward the true enemy. The entity struck first, dark tendrils lashing out with speed that defied its massive, half-formed shape, catching Torvain across the chamber and sending her crashing into ruined scaffolding. Vader met the assault with focused force lightning, crimson-white energy arcing across the entity's writhing mass, drawing a shriek that seemed to resonate through the stone itself rather than through any conventional air. The Slayer closed the distance at a dead sprint, the last of his depleted arsenal cycling toward whatever remained functional, and drove the crucible blade directly into the entity's coalescing center. The ancient weapon's energy met the dark side corruption with a violent, blinding flash, and for the first time since the fissure had torn open, the entity recoiled, not from pain exactly, but from something closer to recognition, as though it understood, on some level, precisely what kind of weapon had just been driven into it. "Hunter," a voice hissed through the chamber, ancient and layered with 10,000 years of malice, arriving not through sound but directly into the minds of every force-sensitive being present. "You are far from your hunting grounds." The Slayer didn't answer. He never did. He simply wrenched the crucible free and struck again, and again, each blow driving the entity backward toward the fissure it had so recently escaped, refusing it any opportunity to consolidate its half-formed strength. Reyes's squad added their own fire from the chamber's edge, blaster bolts doing little real damage, but forcing the entity to divide its attention, buying precious seconds for the three-pronged assault to press its advantage. Vader's lightning, Torvain's recovered blade work, and the Slayer's relentless mechanical violence combined into a storm of destruction that the ancient horror, weakened by 10,000 years of imprisonment, could not fully withstand. The entity let out a final, reality-bending shriek as the combined assault drove it back through the fissure's threshold, the ancient binding rituals, damaged but not entirely destroyed, beginning to reassert themselves around its retreating mass. The Slayer pressed forward to the very edge of the breach, weapons empty, using the crucible blade alone to drive the last of the entity back into the darkness it had clawed its way out of. As the fissure began to seal, light and shadow twisting violently around its collapsing edges, the Slayer felt the familiar pull of dimensional displacement, the same sensation that had dragged him into this galaxy in the first place, now reversing, offering him one final choice before the breach closed forever. Behind him, Vader lowered his blade, watching the ancient wound seal itself shut for what remained of a stunned, ash-choked silence. "It seems," the Sith Lord said quietly, "your galaxy calls you home." The fissure's light collapsed inward, folding the chamber into sudden, ringing silence, broken only by the groan of settling stone and the ragged breathing of everyone still standing. The Doomslayer stood at the threshold of the closing breach, dimensional pull tugging at the edges of his armor, like a current dragging him toward familiar waters. And for one long moment, he simply did not move. Reyes watched him from across the wreckage-strewn chamber, her squad regrouped and bruised but alive. Alive specifically because a stranger who owed them nothing had spent his own advantage to save them. "You could stay," she called out, voice carrying an offer she hadn't fully thought through even as she made it. "Whatever you are, wherever you came from, we could use someone like you." The Slayer didn't answer. He never did. But he turned, briefly, toward Vader and Torvain, both still recovering from a battle that had tested limits none of them had known they possessed. Something passed between Hunter and Sith Lord in that silent exchange. Not respect, not quite, but a mutual acknowledgement of a war neither would forget. Vader inclined his head fractionally. "The Emperor will not forget this day, nor, I suspect, will you." The pull of home intensified, the closing fissure offering its last window before sealing entirely. The Slayer stepped back into the collapsing light without hesitation, without farewell, exactly as he had entered, silent, purposeful, already thinking of the next horde waiting somewhere across dimensions he had barely begun to understand. The fissure sealed with a final, resonant crack, and Ashvar 9 fell quiet. In the weeks that followed, the Empire buried what happened at the excavation site under layers of classified silence, though whispers spread regardless. through rebel cells, through inquisitorious channels, through Palpatine's own private calculations about power he had glimpsed but never quite grasped. Reyes carried the memory back to her superiors as proof that even the galaxy's deepest darkness had limits, and that something beyond their understanding had once, briefly, fought on their side. The Doomslayer returned to his own eternal war unchanged, carrying no medals, seeking no acknowledgement, only the certainty that wherever corruption festered, across however many galaxies it might hide, he would find it, and he would end it.